Beyond the guarded walls of Vatican City, beneath marble corridors and ceremonial silence, there exists a door that almost no one is allowed to cross. It is unmarked, uncelebrated, and rarely photographed, yet behind it stretches one of the most extensive collections of written knowledge on earth. The Vatican Apostolic Archive is not a library in the traditional sense. It is a vault of memory, a place where centuries do not simply rest, but wait. The shelves run for miles, stacked with parchment, codices, and manuscripts that predate modern nations. Some were written by emperors, others by monks whose names history forgot. Many have never been translated. Many have never been read at all. And amongst them are documents so restricted that even credentialed scholars are turned away without explanation. What lies inside is not advertised. What is missing from public catalogs is never acknowledged. Visitors who are granted limited access describe an atmosphere unlike any other archive. The air feels heavier, silence more deliberate. Every page turned carries the weight of consequence because each document represents a version of history that could alter what we think we know. Yet most of the shelves remain sealed, locked behind layers of permission, protocol, and discretion. They exist in plain sight, but functionally invisible. This is the paradox that defines the Vatican's archives, an institution dedicated to preservation, guarding texts the world may never see. Officially, the restrictions are meant to protect fragile documents. Unofficially, the reasons grow murkier. If these writings are harmless, why the secrecy? If they merely confirm accepted history, why deny access? The door remains closed, not with chains or guards, but with silence. And silence, historians know, is often the loudest clue of all. For centuries, rumors have gathered around this threshold, whispering of lost gospels, erased histories, and ideas deemed too powerful for the world beyond these walls. Whether myth or misdirection, the refusal itself fuels suspicion. When knowledge is hidden so carefully, it invites a single haunting question. What truth could justify being locked away forever? Silence dares the curious to imagine answers. The Vatican has never denied that its archives are vast. In carefully worded statements and official tours, it openly acknowledges holding more than 85 kilometers of shelving, containing documents that span nearly 2,000 years. Papal correspondence, diplomatic letters, trial records, financial ledgers, and theological debates are all said to reside within its walls. On the surface, this admission suggests transparency, even generosity, as if the Church has nothing to hide. But acknowledgement is not access. While the Vatican publishes selected inventories and digitizes fragments deemed safe for public consumption, the majority of the archive remains unreachable. Scholars must apply years in advance, justify their research down to the smallest detail, and accept that approval can be revoked without explanation. Even those admitted are confined to specific rooms, allowed to request only a handful of documents per day, always under watchful oversight. What is most striking is how much remains undefined. The Vatican confirms the existence of millions of items, yet offers no comprehensive public catalog. Categories blur, dates vanish, entire collections are referenced only in passing, if at all. The structure of the archive is known, but its contents exist as shadows. This careful balance allows the Church to claim openness while maintaining absolute control. It is a transparency with boundaries, a guided glimpse rather than true visibility. By admitting that the archive exists, the Vatican disarms suspicion on the surface. By limiting what can be seen, it preserves authority beneath it. In this gap between what is acknowledged and what is accessible, curiosity thrives. The church tells the world the shelves are full. It simply refuses to say what is written on them. And in that refusal, generations are left wondering whether history itself has been edited, curated, or quietly rewritten behind locked doors of the archive forever. For every archive, there are fragile pages, but fragility alone does not explain the Vatican's most severe restrictions. Some texts are sealed not because they might crumble, but because of what they might crumble instead. Belief systems, institutional authority, and carefully constructed narratives are far more delicate than parchment. Official explanations tend to focus on preservation, privacy, and scholarly order. Documents involving confessions, political diplomacy, or internal disputes are said to require discretion. Yet historians note that similar materials in other national archives are released after fixed periods. At the Vatican, time does not guarantee disclosure. Some documents remain sealed indefinitely with no public rationale offered. This is where unease begins. When scholars inquire about specific manuscripts, they often encounter vague refusals. Requests are declined not with debate, but with silence. No appeal process, no clarification, just an invisible line that cannot be crossed. The absence of explanation becomes its own form of evidence. Speculation fills the vacuum. Are these texts dangerous because they contradict doctrine? Because they reveal early Christian disagreements that undermine the idea of a unified faith? Or because they document decisions where power, not divinity, shaped belief? Even the possibility unsettles. Throughout history, institutions have restricted knowledge not to protect truth, but to control interpretation. A text does not need to be false to be threatening. It only needs to suggest that things could have been different, that faith evolved, that authority was negotiated, that history was chosen, not inevitable. What makes the Vatican's restrictions unique is their persistence. Centuries pass, popes change, the locks remain, and with every denied request, the question grows heavier. If these texts are harmless, why not let them speak? If they are sacred, why fear scrutiny? Somewhere behind those sealed shelves lies knowledge deemed powerful enough to remain unseen. And power, when hidden for this long, is never accidental. Each restriction feeds curiosity, each silence deepens doubt, and each closed box suggests intention. In the absence of answers, imagination steps in, asking what truth must be hidden to justify such enduring secrecy forever still. The sheer scale of the Vatican Apostolic Archive is difficult to comprehend, even for those who have walked its corridors. Stretching for more than 80 kilometers, the shelves form a labyrinth beneath Vatican City, a silent city of paper and ink hidden below stone and ceremony. Row after row disappears into the distance, each shelf holding centuries compressed into leather bindings and brittle parchment. It is not the grandeur that unsettles visitors, but the stillness. Most of these documents are untouched by modern scholarship. Many were cataloged generations ago, others only partially described, their titles vague, their contents assumed rather than confirmed. Some boxes have not been opened in hundreds of years. Others were sealed so long ago that no living archivist remembers why. The result is a vast accumulation of written memory that exists almost outside of time, preserved but inert. In other great archives, scale implies collaboration. armies of researchers steadily uncovering and reinterpreting the past. Here, scale produces the opposite effect. The enormity becomes a barrier. Only a fraction of the collection can be requested, and only a fraction of that fraction is ever studied. The rest waits in darkness, not erased, but unheard. What is most unsettling is not what has been read, but what hasn't. Entire centuries remain effectively silent, their voices locked away not by decay, but by procedure. The past exists here in overwhelming abundance, yet modern understanding is shaped by a narrow sliver of what survives behind these walls. Silence accumulates in such places, not the absence of sound, but the presence of withheld stories. Each unopened manuscript represents a perspective lost to time, a possibility never tested, a version of history never allowed to speak. When shelves stretch farther than inquiry is permitted to go, ignorance becomes structural, and so the archive endures as a monument to preservation without revelation. Miles of shelves stand intact, orderly and closed, holding answers to questions no one is officially allowed to ask. In that quiet imbalance between what exists and what is known, the silence itself becomes a historical force, shaping understanding by omission rather than destruction. Over the decades, countless historians have arrived at the Vatican with credentials polished and intentions sincere, believing that knowledge, once sought in good faith, would eventually be granted. Many never made it past the application stage. Others were approved, only to discover that the documents they requested were quietly removed from consideration. No reasons were given, no alternatives suggested, just a polite refusal delivered with finality. Some of these scholars were not outsiders or provocateurs, but respected academics from prestigious universities, fluent in Latin, Greek, and ancient dialects, trained specifically to handle fragile texts. They were prepared to spend years deciphering a single manuscript, yet their proposals stalled without comment, their research paths abruptly cut short. In private correspondence, a few described the experience as disorienting, even humiliating. Doors that appeared open simply vanished. What raises suspicion is not that access is limited, but how selectively it is denied. Certain themes seem to trigger rejection more often than others. Early Christian diversity, alternative chronologies, non-canonical texts, or interactions between the Church and pre-Christian belief systems. Requests touching these areas tend to dissolve into silence. A handful of scholars have spoken cautiously after their careers ended. They describe being warned not to pursue certain questions, advised that their reputations could suffer if they insisted. Others recall being granted access to innocuous material while adjacent files, clearly related, were declared unavailable without explanation. The pattern suggests guidance rather than coincidence. These denials rarely make headlines. Academia moves on. Funding shifts. Careers adapt. But the quiet accumulation of refusals paints a troubling picture. When trained historians are prevented from even verifying what exists, skepticism becomes inevitable. Knowledge withheld from scrutiny does not simply disappear. It lingers, raising a question that refuses to fade. What discovery was important enough to turn experts away at the threshold? In most archives around the world, restriction follows a system. Documents are sealed for defined reasons, assigned dates for release, and governed by clear legal frameworks. At the Vatican Apostolic Archive, such clarity is strikingly absent. Texts are restricted, but rarely classified in any publicly explainable way. There is no visible hierarchy of secrecy, no timetable for disclosure, no formal explanation of why one manuscript is accessible while another remains forbidden. This absence of criteria is what unsettles historians most. Requests are approved or denied behind closed doors, guided by internal judgment rather than transparent policy. Two researchers can ask for similar materials and receive entirely different outcomes. One gains access, the other is quietly refused. The logic behind these decisions is never shared, making the archive feel less like a scholarly institution and more like a controlled narrative space. Without classification, restriction becomes subjective, and where subjectivity exists, speculation follows. Scholars begin to notice patterns not officially acknowledged. Texts touching on theological disputes, early doctrinal chaos, or non-Christian influences appear harder to access. Manuscripts tied to political power, struggles between popes and emperors, seem to vanish into ambiguity. Nothing is confirmed, yet nothing feels random. The system allows the Vatican to deny accusations of secrecy while practicing it in effect. After all, how can something be classified if no such category officially exists? The language shields the institution, even as the outcome remains the same. Information is withheld, but without leaving fingerprints. Over time, this creates a distorted historical lens. Researchers are forced to build interpretations around what is available, unaware of what has been excluded. History becomes shaped not only by evidence, but by absence. And absence, when systematic, is never neutral. The lack of criteria invites a deeper question. If restriction is not based on age, fragility, or privacy alone, what is it based on? Influence, consequence, belief? Somewhere in the silent logic governing access lies a framework known only to those who enforce it. Until that framework is revealed, every sealed document invites suspicion, and every denial hints at narratives deliberately left untold, waiting behind shelves no catalog can fully explain. Long before the Bible became a single bound authority, Christianity existed as a fractured and contested movement. In the first centuries after Jesus' death, stories about his life spread not through one official account, but through dozens of competing texts. Some were copied obsessively, others debated fiercely, and many were eventually erased from public memory. These were the Gospels that did not make the Bible. Among them were writings later labeled apocryphal and Gnostic, texts that presented versions of Christianity unfamiliar to modern believers. In these pages, Jesus speaks in riddles rather than sermons. Salvation comes through knowledge rather than obedience. Heaven and hell are not places, but states of understanding. God is not always singular, and creation itself is sometimes described as flawed, even mistaken. The Gospel of Thomas contains sayings attributed to Jesus that resemble philosophy more than doctrine, suggesting that the divine kingdom exists within the individual, not the church. The Gospel of Mary portrays Mary Magdalene not as a follower, but as a spiritual authority whose insight surpasses that of the apostles. Other texts describe a Christ who laughs at ignorance, questions sacrifice, and downplays hierarchy entirely. To later church leaders, these ideas were not just incorrect, they were dangerous. They undermined the need for centralized authority, priesthood, and ritual. If divine truth could be accessed directly, what role remained for the institution? As councils met and doctrine hardened, these alternative gospels were condemned, excluded, and labeled heretical. Copies were destroyed, hidden, or buried, like the Nag Hammadi texts discovered centuries later in the Egyptian desert. Yet some scholars believe not all copies were lost. References in early correspondence suggest that certain forbidden gospels were seized and archived rather than destroyed. Rome, after all, was meticulous. What could not be erased might still be controlled. The existence of these texts forces an uncomfortable realization. Christianity was not born unified. It was shaped through selection. Ideas were chosen. Others were rejected. And those rejections defined the faith as much as the accepted canon did. If alternative gospels survive within restricted archives, they represent more than theological curiosities. They offer glimpses into paths Christianity might have taken, voices that were silenced not by time, but by decision. And once that possibility is considered, the Bible begins to look less like a beginning and more like an ending chosen from many competing truths. Within the forbidden Gospels, Jesus emerges as a figure profoundly different from the one taught from pulpits for centuries. He is not always the suffering Savior defined by sacrifice and redemption, but a teacher of hidden wisdom, speaking to those capable of understanding rather than commanding obedience from the masses. This Christ does not build institutions. He dismantles illusions. In Gnostic texts, Jesus often emphasizes knowledge over faith. Salvation is not achieved through belief alone, but through awakening. He speaks of light trapped within humanity, urging followers to remember who they truly are rather than submit to external authority. Sin in this framework is ignorance, not moral failure. Redemption comes not from the cross, but from insight. Some writings portray Jesus as openly critical of religious leaders, not merely as corrupt, but as fundamentally misguided. In certain passages, he mocks ritual, dismisses sacrifice, and warns that blind obedience leads people farther from truth, not closer to it. This version of Christ is unsettling because he cannot be controlled. He offers no hierarchy, no priesthood, no singular path enforced by fear. Perhaps most controversial is how these texts redefine Jesus' relationship with his followers. Mary Magdalene is depicted as his closest confidant, the one who understands his teachings most deeply. The apostles are shown doubting her authority, not because she is wrong, but because they cannot accept it. The conflict is not theological, but human. Such portrayals threaten the foundations of organized Christianity. A Christ who teaches self-discovery weakens dependence on doctrine. A Christ who elevates inner knowledge challenges external power. If these texts were widely accepted, the church would no longer stand as the sole gatekeeper between humanity and the divine. This is the Christ the church never taught, not because he was unknown, but because he was incompatible. And if his words still exist, sealed away, they remain dangerous not for what they deny, but for what they give back to those who read them. The question that lingers over the forbidden Gospels is not simply why they were excluded, but why they were hidden so thoroughly. Were these writings suppressed to protect believers from confusion, or were they concealed to preserve authority? The answer depends on where faith ends and control begins. From the church's perspective, early Christianity faced chaos. Competing doctrines threatened to fracture a fragile movement. Leaders argued that unity required boundaries, and boundaries required decisions. Some texts, they claimed, risked misleading the faithful, promoting ideas that could dilute core beliefs or invite dangerous interpretations. In this light, suppression becomes an act of protection, a necessary pruning to allow faith to survive. Yet protection can easily become possession. By deciding which voices were legitimate, The Church did more than clarify doctrine. It defined truth itself. Alternative interpretations were not debated openly. They were erased. Their absence created the illusion of unanimity, a single story stretching backward in time, unbroken and divinely guided. What believers inherited was not the full conversation, but the conclusion. The troubling aspect is that these texts were not always destroyed. Some were hidden, archived, preserved in silence. This suggests they were considered valuable, even powerful. If the goal was simply to eliminate error, why keep the evidence? Preservation implies awareness. It implies choice. Control does not require falsehood. It requires limitation. By narrowing the range of acceptable belief, institutions stabilize themselves. A Christ who empowers individuals threatens that stability. A faith that encourages questioning weakens hierarchy. In such a system, withholding information becomes an act of governance. Whether motivated by fear of confusion or fear of loss, the outcome is the same. Generations inherited a curated faith, unaware of what was removed to make it coherent. The forbidden gospels exist in a gray space between danger and deliverance, and until they are fully revealed, the question remains unresolved. Were they hidden to protect belief or to protect power from belief's most radical implications? Long before Christianity emerged as a religion, before Rome declared itself Christian, before the Church defined doctrine or canon, the ancient world was already writing its own explanations of existence. Civilizations rose and fell, leaving behind myths, rituals, star charts, and philosophical systems that attempted to answer the same questions Christianity later claimed to resolve. According to some scholars, fragments of that pre-Christian knowledge now rest inside the Vatican's archives, quietly absorbed as Rome transitioned from empire to church. As Christianity spread, it did not do so in a vacuum. It inherited libraries, temples, and intellectual traditions from the cultures it replaced. When Rome converted, it did not burn everything it conquered. In many cases, it collected. Pagan texts, state records, philosophical treatises, and ritual manuals were seized, translated, or reclassified. Some were condemned publicly, while others vanished into ecclesiastical storage. References in early church writings hint at documents far older than Christianity itself, texts attributed to Egyptian priests, Greek philosophers, and Near Eastern scholars whose works no longer survive elsewhere. These writings were often described as dangerous, not because they were primitive, but because they were sophisticated. They offered cosmologies, moral systems, and explanations of the universe that rivaled emerging Christian theology. What unsettles historians is not the idea that such texts existed, but that some may still exist. Unlike libraries destroyed by war or neglect, the Vatican's archive represents continuity. If documents were collected in late antiquity, they were likely preserved. And if they challenged Christian narratives, sealing them away would have been easier than destroying them. A text older than Rome carries authority of its own. It suggests that truth did not begin with the Church, and that divine understanding may have predated Christian revelation. Such implications would have been deeply uncomfortable for an institution defining itself as the ultimate source of spiritual history. If the Vatican holds writings that predate Christianity, they represent more than historical artifacts. They are reminders that faith was layered over older knowledge, not born in isolation, and that realization alone could reshape how history understands the Church's place in humanity's much longer search for meaning. As the Christian church expanded across Europe and the Mediterranean, it inherited more than territory, it inherited knowledge. Pagan temples became churches, festivals were repurposed, and ancient wisdom was reinterpreted through a Christian lens. Yet not all of that inherited knowledge was erased. Some of it was quietly preserved. Ancient philosophical works from Greece and Rome explored ethics, metaphysics, and the nature of the soul. Centuries before Christian theology formalized similar questions. Astronomical texts mapped the heavens with surprising accuracy, tracking planetary cycles, eclipses, and celestial alignments that later theologians would reinterpret as divine order. Ritual manuscripts describe symbolic acts meant to align humanity with cosmic forces rather than a singular God. Publicly, the church condemned paganism as false and dangerous. Privately, it studied it. Early Christian scholars translated and debated pagan works, drawing from them while distancing themselves from their origins. This created a contradiction. The church rejected pagan belief, yet relied on pagan knowledge to construct its intellectual framework. Some historians believe the most controversial of these texts were never destroyed, only hidden. Knowledge of the stars, sacred geometry, healing practices, and altered states of consciousness may have been considered too powerful or too destabilizing for open circulation. Preserving it while denying it allowed control without loss. In this way, the church became both gatekeeper and inheritor. Pagan wisdom survived, but under supervision, stripped of context, reframed, and sealed away, it existed in Christian hands, but outside public reach. If such texts remain in restricted archives, they reveal a deeper truth. Christianity did not simply replace earlier worldviews. It absorbed them, filtered them, and decided which fragments humanity was allowed to remember. The rest was locked away, waiting for a future that might question why. Throughout history, institutions have attempted to destroy ideas they deemed dangerous. Yet destruction is rarely complete. Fire consumes paper, but memory persists. In the case of the Vatican, preservation often replaced erasure. What could not be eliminated was contained. Publicly condemned knowledge has a strange tendency to survive in private. The church denounced heretical texts, pagan rituals, and forbidden philosophies, yet its archives grew larger with every century. This contradiction suggests a deeper strategy. To preserve power, one must understand what threatens it. By keeping forbidden texts, the church retained awareness of alternative narratives. It knew what had been rejected and why. This allowed doctrine to adapt, counter, and evolve while maintaining the illusion of permanence. Knowledge, even condemned knowledge, became a resource. Some of the most troubling possibilities emerge here. If texts describing alternative origins of humanity, cycles of civilization, or cosmic forces exist, their suppression would not be about falsehood, but impact. Such ideas could destabilize belief by expanding it beyond controlled boundaries. Preservation also implies fear. You do not archive what you consider meaningless. You archive what you might need, or what you cannot fully dismiss. The Vatican silence around these materials suggests awareness of their enduring influence. Knowledge the church could not erase remains powerful precisely because it was acknowledged internally. It represents roads not taken, truths postponed, questions deferred indefinitely. Locked away, it becomes myth. Released, it becomes challenge. If the Vatican preserved what it publicly condemned, then its archives are not merely records of faith, but records of doubt. and somewhere among those sealed pages may lie ideas strong enough to survive centuries of silence, waiting for the moment they are allowed to speak again. Long before the book of Genesis became the dominant story of human beginnings, ancient cultures told their own versions of how humanity came into existence. These narratives were not uniform, and they did not always agree with one another, but many shared a striking feature. Humanity was not created in a single divine moment, nor was it always the central purpose of creation. In some texts, humans were an afterthought, in others an experiment. Ancient Mesopotamian tablets describe humans fashioned to serve the gods, created to labor so higher beings would not have to. In certain Egyptian traditions, humanity emerges from cycles of destruction and rebirth, wiped out and recreated more than once. Other accounts suggest humans were modified rather than made, altered from existing beings through divine intervention. These stories challenge the idea of a single, perfect creation. What unsettles scholars is how often these narratives overlap across cultures, separated by geography and time. Similar themes appear in Sumerian, Akkadian, and even early Hebrew texts that did not survive into the biblical canon. References to failed creations, divine regret, and repeated resets of civilization appear again and again. Such accounts also conflict with modern scientific narratives, not by offering clear alternatives, but by complicating the timeline. They hint at long-lost epochs, forgotten civilizations, and events erased from memory. Humanity in these stories is older, more fragile, and less central than tradition suggests. If preserved within restricted archives, these creation narratives pose a dual threat. They challenge biblical authority by suggesting Scripture was selective, and they unsettle scientific certainty by implying deep history may be incomplete. Humanity becomes not the beginning of the story, but a chapter edited from a much longer book, one few are allowed to read. Among the most controversial figures in suppressed ancient texts are beings that defy simple classification. Giants, watchers, and hybrid entities appear repeatedly in manuscripts deemed too dangerous or too absurd for official doctrine, yet their consistency across cultures raises troubling questions. The Book of Enoch, excluded from the biblical canon but referenced indirectly within it, describes watchers descending to earth, sharing forbidden knowledge with humans. They teach metallurgy, astronomy, and medicine, but also warfare and deception. Their offspring, the Nephilim, are described as giants, violent and uncontrollable, triggering divine judgment. Similar beings appear elsewhere. Mesopotamian texts describe Apkallu, semi-divine figures who bring civilization before being cast out. Greek myths speak of titans and demigods. These accounts differ in tone, but share a core idea. Humanity was not alone, and knowledge once came from non-human sources. Such stories blur the boundary between myth and memory. Were these beings symbolic representations of lost elites or literal entities removed from history? The Church rejected literal interpretations, framing them as allegory, yet preserving the texts suggests the question was never fully settled. If non-human intelligences once shaped humanity, the implications are staggering. Knowledge becomes inherited, not discovered. Civilization becomes guided, not accidental. And humanity's place in the universe becomes far less secure than doctrine allows. Stories do not vanish by accident. They disappear because they are removed. The narratives of alternative creation, giants, and forbidden beings posed a fundamental problem for religious authority. They complicated morality, blurred divine hierarchy and weakened the idea of a singular, controlled origin. If humans were created to serve, not rule, then spiritual superiority collapses. If knowledge was given by forbidden beings, then wisdom becomes suspect. If humanity has been reset before, then apocalypse becomes cyclical rather than final. These ideas destabilize faith built on certainty and linear purpose. There is also a deeper discomfort. These stories challenge human exceptionalism. They suggest humanity is not the pinnacle of creation, but a participant in a larger, indifferent system. Such humility is difficult to govern. By removing these narratives, institutions simplified belief. Creation became clean. Evil became external. Humanity became central. The cost of that clarity was complexity, ambiguity, and older truths that refused to fit. Yet disappearance does not equal extinction. Suppressed stories linger in fragments, whispers, and forbidden manuscripts. They survive because they resonate. They answer questions doctrine avoids. Whether these narratives threatened religious power or human identity itself remains unresolved. Perhaps they threatened both, and that may be why they were not destroyed completely, only hidden, waiting for a time when humanity might be ready to confront origins far stranger than it was ever taught to imagine. Throughout history, prophecy has served two opposing purposes: comfort and warning. Public scripture tends to emphasize the former, offering reassurance that chaos will end in redemption. But scattered references suggest that not all prophetic texts followed this pattern. Some foretold not salvation, but repetition, not a final victory of good, but cycles of collapse that humanity could neither escape nor fully understand. Ancient prophetic manuscripts, mentioned indirectly in correspondence and theological debates, describe history as circular rather than linear. Civilizations rise, decay, fall, and rise again, each time forgetting what came before. These texts do not promise divine rescue. Instead, they warn of inevitability. Knowledge is lost. Faith corrodes. Power concentrates. Collapse follows. Such prophecies would have been deeply unsettling. They undermine the idea of a singular end time, replacing it with endless recurrence. Apocalypse becomes not an event, but a condition. Humanity is not marching toward resolution, but looping through consequence. Some scholars argue these texts were sealed because they offered no moral clarity. There are no chosen survivors, no final judgment, no eternal kingdom, only patterns. Humanity's greatest flaw, these writings suggest, is its inability to remember. Each collapse is preceded by the same signs: arrogance, corruption, blind faith in authority. If preserved in restricted archives, these prophecies represent a worldview fundamentally at odds with institutional religion. They do not inspire obedience. They inspire awareness. And awareness, once spread, is difficult to contain. A prophecy that offers no hope of escape is dangerous, not because it is false, but because it might be true. And if humanity has already lived through multiple forgotten endings, the greatest threat is not apocalypse itself, but recognition that it has happened before, silently erased from collective memory again and again. Among the most controversial of sealed prophecies are those that turn inward, predicting not the fall of nations, but the collapse of religious institutions themselves. These texts do not frame the church as humanity's refuge in dark times, but as a participant in decline, vulnerable to the same corruption and decay it warns against. Some prophecies describe a future where spiritual authority fragments, not through persecution, but through irrelevance. Faith becomes ritual without meaning. Leaders prioritize power over guidance. Belief persists, but hollowed out, disconnected from its origins. The institution survives in form, but not in spirit. Other texts are more explicit. They speak of internal collapse, of schisms driven not by doctrine, but by ambition. The greatest threat does not come from outside forces, but from within. The church falls not because it is attacked, but because it forgets its purpose. For an institution claiming divine guidance and permanence, such prophecies are existentially threatening. They suggest that no authority is immune to entropy, that sacred structures are subject to the same laws as empires and kingdoms. Preserving such texts while denying their existence allows control without confrontation. To acknowledge them publicly would invite doubt. To debate them would legitimize the possibility of failure. Silence becomes survival. If the church's end is foretold, then history is not protected by faith alone. And that idea, once released, would be impossible to contain within doctrine. Revealing prophecies of cyclical collapse and institutional downfall would not simply challenge belief. It would destabilize it. Faith systems depend on narrative coherence, on the promise that suffering leads somewhere meaningful. Texts that deny resolution replace hope with vigilance and obedience with skepticism. Such knowledge reshapes responsibility. If collapse is inevitable, individuals may question why they should submit to authority at all. If institutions are destined to fail, loyalty becomes conditional. Control weakens. Silence, then, is not cowardice, it is strategy. By sealing these texts, institutions preserve stability. They prevent panic, fragmentation, and the erosion of trust. The cost is ignorance, but ignorance can be managed. Awareness cannot. There is also fear of self-fulfillment. Prophecy, once known, influences behavior. If people believe collapse is inevitable, they may hasten it. If they believe authority will fall, they may withdraw support. Silence delays consequence. Yet silence has its own danger. Suppressed knowledge does not disappear. It surfaces in fragments, rumors, and alternative movements. Each whisper erodes certainty. The Vatican's refusal to release apocalyptic texts may be less about hiding the future and more about protecting the present. Because once belief systems are exposed as temporary, history no longer feels guided. It feels fragile. And in that fragility lies the most destabilizing realization of all, that humanity may not be progressing toward salvation, but circling the same ending again and again, unaware it has already lived through it before. Scattered through ancient manuscripts are descriptions of machines that feel strangely out of place in their time. Not myths or metaphors, but mechanical explanations written with confidence, as if the author assumed the reader already understood the principles involved. These accounts appear in sacred texts, marginal notes, and technical passages embedded within religious writings, where few thought to look for technology at all. Some describe rotating spheres used to track celestial motion with uncanny precision. Others reference devices powered by steam, water pressure, or hidden forces capable of movement without human effort. There are accounts of automated doors opening within temples, statues that appeared to speak, and mechanisms that measured time not by shadows, but by internal systems of gears and flow. To modern readers, these descriptions resemble early blueprints more than spiritual allegory. Mainstream history often dismisses such passages as symbolic or exaggerated. Yet the language is practical, even instructional. Materials are listed, ratios are noted, adjustments are advised. This is not how myth is usually written. It reads like knowledge intended to be used. The existence of the Antikythera mechanism, discovered centuries later and proven to be an advanced astronomical calculator, lends credibility to the idea that ancient technology was far more sophisticated than once believed. If one such device survived by chance, how many others were recorded only in writing, their physical forms lost or deliberately removed? Within sacred manuscripts, technology gains a protective disguise. Hidden beneath theology, it could be preserved without attracting attention. A machine described as divine wonder escapes scrutiny more easily than one labeled invention. If the Vatican archives contain texts describing mechanisms beyond their supposed era, they challenge the narrative of linear progress. They suggest innovation did not begin in modernity, but was interrupted, forgotten, perhaps even suppressed. These machines are unsettling, not because they are impossible, but because they imply continuity. Knowledge passed forward, then broken. And if humanity once possessed tools it no longer understands, the question becomes unavoidable. Who decided which technologies were allowed to survive history and which were quietly left behind? Beyond machines, some ancient texts contain knowledge that appears disturbingly premature. Astronomical records describe planetary movements with accuracy that should have required telescopes. Medical manuscripts outline surgical techniques and anatomical understanding that seem incompatible with their era. Engineering texts reference stress, load distribution, and materials science in ways that feel unmistakably modern. Such insights are often explained away as coincidence or retroactive interpretation. Yet when patterns repeat across cultures, dismissal becomes harder. Star charts align too precisely. Medical remedies work too consistently. Architectural principles endure too reliably. Restricted manuscripts reportedly contain calculations and observations that suggest long-term data collection spanning generations. This implies stable institutions of knowledge, capable of preserving and refining understanding over centuries. Civilization in these accounts appears less primitive and more interrupted. What makes this knowledge threatening is not its existence, but its implication. If ancient societies understood more than we credit them for, then progress is not a straight ascent. It is a series of rises and losses. Modern science becomes recovery, not discovery. For institutions built on the narrative of enlightenment replacing darkness, this idea is deeply destabilizing. It suggests that humanity once knew, then forgot. And forgetting, unlike ignorance, implies responsibility. If such knowledge survives in restricted archives, it represents a past that refuses to remain inferior. A reminder that advancement can be erased as easily as it can be achieved, and that history's greatest mystery may not be how we learned so much, but how we lost it. Modern civilization prides itself on invention, steam engines, electricity, medicine, space travel, all framed as triumphs of recent centuries. But if ancient texts reveal advanced knowledge long before modern timelines allow, then progress must be redefined. Innovation becomes recurrence. This idea forces a radical reconsideration of history. Instead of a steady climb from ignorance to understanding, humanity may have experienced multiple peaks. Each collapse wiped away context, leaving fragments to be rediscovered generations later. What we call breakthroughs may be echoes, Such a model explains the recurring appearance of advanced concepts in ancient texts. It explains why knowledge sometimes appears fully formed, without clear developmental steps. It also explains institutional discomfort. A cyclical history weakens claims of uniqueness and inevitability. If progress can be lost, then civilization is fragile. If knowledge can disappear, then authority over it becomes power. Deciding what survives becomes as important as discovery itself. The Vatican's archives, as a continuous institution spanning centuries of upheaval, would be uniquely positioned to preserve such fragments. Whether intentionally or incidentally, it may hold evidence that modernity is not humanity's first awakening. Rewriting the timeline of progress does not diminish human achievement, it deepens it. It suggests resilience, repetition, and warning that advancement without memory leads to collapse. If we are rediscovering what was once known, then the future is not uncharted. It is familiar territory we failed to remember. And somewhere among sealed shelves may lie proof that humanity has walked this path before, confident, advanced, and unaware of how easily it could all be lost again. Access to the deepest levels of the Vatican Apostolic Archive is granted to only a handful of individuals at any given time. These are not casual librarians, but archivists selected through years of service, trust, and discretion. Before they ever touch the most restricted materials, they take oaths, not unlike those sworn by clergy, binding them to silence long after their work ends. These archivists operate in a world defined by restraint. They catalog, preserve, and transport texts that few others are permitted to know exist. Their role is not to interpret, question, or publicize, but to maintain continuity. Many spend decades working among documents that shape human history, yet leave no public record of what they have seen. Former Vatican insiders describe the oath as absolute. There are no allowances for retirement, academic publication, or historical curiosity. Silence is not optional. Breaking it carries consequences that are never clearly stated but universally understood. Careers vanish, reputations dissolve. In some cases, individuals simply retreat from public life altogether. What makes these archivists unsettling figures is not their secrecy, but their proximity. They are witnesses to knowledge that exists, yet does not circulate. They know which boxes are never requested, which shelves are rarely opened, and which materials require special authorization. Patterns emerge, even if conclusions are forbidden. Some archivists have hinted in carefully measured words that the weight of this knowledge is psychological. To guard secrets of such magnitude requires detachment. You learn to separate belief from evidence, faith from record. You learn to live with unanswered questions. Bound by oath, these individuals become living extensions of the archive itself. They preserve not only texts, but silence. And in doing so, they embody the Vatican's most effective barrier. Not locked doors or sealed shelves, but people who know the truth and will never be allowed to speak it aloud, despite the culture of silence. Whispers occasionally escape. Over the years, anonymous testimonies have surfaced from individuals claiming insider access to restricted Vatican materials. These accounts are fragmented, unverifiable, and often dismissed, yet their similarities are difficult to ignore. Some describe encountering texts that radically contradict accepted timelines. Others claim to have seen documents detailing suppressed theological debates or records of decisions made purely for political survival. A few speak of material so unsettling it challenged their faith entirely. None provide names. None offer documents. Fear lingers between every word. These testimonies tend to appear late in life, after careers have ended and consequences feel less immediate. Even then, details remain vague. Locations are blurred. Dates softened. The message is implied rather than declared. This ambiguity protects the speaker, but also weakens credibility. Skeptics argue these accounts are products of imagination or resentment, but believers point to patterns. The same themes recur, the same sense of shock, the same insistence that what was found was not evil, but disruptive. Leaks, when they occur, are indirect. Not documents released, but ideas echoed elsewhere. Concepts that appear suddenly in fringe scholarship, spiritual movements, or alternative histories, as if fragments have escaped without revealing their source. In an institution built on continuity, even a whisper is dangerous. Truth does not need to be shouted to spread. It only needs to be suggested. Whether these testimonies represent genuine insight or collective myth, they persist. And persistence itself is a form of pressure, slowly testing the strength of silence imposed for centuries. In academic circles, progress is measured by publication, recognition, and peer engagement. When these vanish abruptly, questions follow. Over the years, several scholars researching early Christianity, church history, or Vatican records have experienced unexplained professional derailments. Grants withdrawn, access revoked, reputations quietly undermined. These individuals were not radicals. Many were respected, cautious, and methodical. Their work did not openly accuse or attack. It asked questions that drifted too close to restricted territory. Shortly after, momentum stalled. Invitations ceased. Projects dissolved. Some historians recount being warned informally, suggestions to shift focus, advice framed as concern. Others recall subtle obstruction, delays that stretched indefinitely, requests lost, approvals reversed without comment, nothing dramatic enough to protest, but enough to end a career's trajectory. More troubling are cases where scholars withdrew entirely. Research abandoned. Public presence erased. In rare instances, individuals disappeared from academic life altogether, leaving behind unfinished manuscripts and unanswered inquiries. Official explanations cite personal choice. Privately, colleagues express confusion. There is no paper trail linking these outcomes to suppression. That is precisely the point. Influence rarely announces itself. It operates through opportunity denied rather than punishment imposed. Whether coincidence or consequence, the pattern fuels suspicion. When inquiry into specific historical questions consistently leads to professional isolation, curiosity turns to caution. Others learn to avoid similar paths. The result is self-regulation. Silence enforced not through force, but through example. Knowledge remains untouched, not because it is inaccessible, but because the cost of pursuing it has been quietly demonstrated. If the Vatican were to release its most restricted texts, the first collision would not be political or scientific, but deeply personal. Faith for millions is not an abstract concept. It is inherited, practiced, and trusted across generations. It provides moral structure, meaning, and comfort. Facts, when they challenge that structure, do not arrive gently. They disrupt. Disclosure of alternative gospels, suppressed histories, or contradictory doctrines would force believers to confront the idea that faith was curated, that beliefs were shaped not only by divine inspiration, but by human decision. For some, this realization would feel like betrayal. For others, liberation. But for many, it would fracture the quiet certainty that belief systems depend on. Religious institutions thrive on coherence. Stories align. Timelines reinforce doctrine. Authority feels stable because it appears ancient and unbroken. Facts that introduce complexity weaken that illusion. A faith exposed as historically negotiated rather than divinely fixed becomes vulnerable to reinterpretation. This does not mean belief would disappear. Faith is resilient, but it would change. Individuals might separate spirituality from institution, belief from obedience. The question would no longer be what to believe, but why. That shift alone alters centuries of religious power dynamics. History shows that when facts collide with faith, institutions rarely emerge unchanged. The Reformation was sparked by access to information. Translation alone reshaped Europe. Imagine what unrestricted access to the Church's deepest archives could do. The danger is not disbelief, it is fragmentation. Competing interpretations would multiply, certainty would erode. For an institution built on guiding belief, this is the ultimate risk, and so the tension remains unresolved. Faith asks for trust. Facts ask for scrutiny. If both are finally placed side by side, centuries of belief may not collapse, but they would never stand the same way again. The release of hidden texts would not stop at theology. History underpins power. Nations justify borders, authority, and identity through carefully constructed narratives. If those narratives are exposed as incomplete or manipulated, political consequences follow. Church and state have been intertwined for centuries. Monarchs ruled by divine right. Wars were sanctified. Laws were justified through Scripture. If foundational religious history is destabilized, the legitimacy of past and present power structures comes into question. Hidden documents revealing political compromises, strategic fabrications, or intentional suppression would force a reevaluation of historical morality. Heroes might look less noble, villains less clear. Entire eras could require reinterpretation. This destabilizes not just belief, but national identity. On a global scale, revelation creates imbalance. Those who control information control narrative. If one institution releases centuries of hidden history, others are pressured to respond. Archives open, secrets surface. The past becomes contested territory. Power thrives on continuity. Disruption weakens authority, invites dissent, and accelerates reform. For governments and institutions built on inherited legitimacy, this is deeply unsettling. Hidden history is not passive. It actively supports existing structures. Releasing it would shift influence from institutions to individuals, from tradition to inquiry. In a world already struggling with misinformation and distrust, sudden disclosure could amplify chaos. Truth does not arrive in a vacuum. It arrives in systems shaped by fear, loyalty, and ambition. And once released, it cannot be recalled. The most difficult question is not whether humanity deserves the truth, but whether it is ready for it. Knowledge changes responsibility. Once you know, you cannot unknow. Belief becomes choice, not inheritance. If suppressed texts reveal that humanity's origins are uncertain, that progress is cyclical, that institutions are temporary, the psychological impact would be profound. Comforting narratives would dissolve. Meaning would need reconstruction. History shows that sudden truth destabilizes before it enlightens. Copernicus displaced Earth from the center of the universe. Darwin displaced humanity from divine uniqueness. Each revelation reshaped identity and worldview. The Vatican's archives may hold truths of similar magnitude. Some would grow stronger through understanding. Others would retreat. Extremes would form. Certainty would be replaced with questions, and questions demand maturity. Perhaps the greatest fear is not disbelief, but humility, accepting that humanity forgot, failed, and repeated mistakes requires confronting fragility. It challenges the myth of inevitable progress. The Vatican silence may stem from this dilemma. Not all truths heal. Some fracture before they integrate. Releasing everything at once could overwhelm societies already struggling to process the past. And yet, withholding truth carries its own cost. Ignorance preserves stability, but delays growth. Humanity remains protected, but confined. The question remains unresolved. Is humanity strong enough to face forgotten truths, or does it still need the comfort of curated history? Somewhere between silence and revelation lies a choice that will shape the future. And until that choice is made, the truth remains waiting, sealed behind doors. History has not yet decided to open. The Vatican silence is often framed as secrecy, but from within the institution, it is understood as stewardship. For centuries, the Church has seen itself not only as a guardian of faith, but as a custodian of stability. Knowledge in this view is not neutral. It shapes belief, behavior, and social order. To release information without regard for consequence would be irresponsible, even dangerous. Spiritually, some texts challenge the foundations of doctrine itself. They complicate narratives of salvation, authority, and divine purpose. If belief fractures, so does the moral framework built upon it. For millions, faith is not philosophical, it is lived. Sudden disruption risks despair as much as enlightenment. Politically, the Church exists within a web of global influence. Its history is inseparable from kings, empires, borders, and law. Documents revealing strategic decisions, compromises, or manipulations would not remain historical curiosities. They would reshape accountability. Silence protects continuity. Existentially, there is a deeper concern. Some knowledge destabilizes identity. Texts suggesting humanity is not central, not unique, or not progressing threaten the stories societies tell themselves to endure uncertainty. Meaning once lost is difficult to rebuild. Silence then becomes a form of containment, not denial, but delay. A belief that humanity may one day be ready but is not yet. Whether this is wisdom or fear depends on perspective, but the result is the same. The archive remains closed, the truth suspended, and history shaped not only by what is known, but by what is intentionally withheld for the sake of order. Not all secrets are temporary. Some are sealed with the understanding that they may never be revealed. Within the Vatican's archives, there are likely documents considered too destabilizing for any era, not just the present one. These may include texts that irreversibly undermine foundational beliefs, or records that expose decisions made in moments of fear, ambition, or desperation. Knowledge that cannot be contextualized without causing harm may be deemed better left untouched. There is also the possibility that some truths lose meaning when removed from their time. Without cultural context, they mislead rather than inform. Preservation in such cases becomes preservation of potential rather than instruction. The idea that some knowledge is meant to remain buried is unsettling, but not unprecedented. Throughout history, societies have hidden truths they believed humanity was unprepared to confront. Whether they were right remains debated. If such documents exist, they represent boundaries, not just secrets. limits placed on understanding itself, and the chilling reality is that some of those boundaries may never be crossed. Not because the knowledge is gone, but because it is intentionally kept beyond reach indefinitely. At the heart of the Vatican's archives lies a question more unsettling than any hidden text. It is not what is being concealed, but who holds the authority to conceal it. If truth exists, but access to it is restricted, who decides when humanity is ready to know? History is shaped by those who control narrative. What survives becomes truth. What is hidden becomes speculation. Over centuries, this power determines belief, identity, and memory itself. If knowledge is filtered to preserve stability, then humanity grows protected, but constrained. If truth is released without restraint, chaos may follow. Between these extremes lies a moral dilemma with no clear resolution. Perhaps the most haunting possibility is that humanity has already forgotten essential truths, not through accident, but through design. That what we know is only what we were permitted to remember. The archive stands as a symbol of that choice. Shelves filled with answers, doors closed by intention. The question is no longer what is inside, but who decides its fate. If truth is locked away, is it still truth? And if knowledge is withheld for humanity's own good, at what point does protection become control? Until that question is answered, the secret still breathes. Waiting, watching, and asking whether the greatest mystery is not what we do not know, but who decided we